It's my honor today to be joined on this panel of lightning sessions with Dr. Julia Kravchenko, who I'm going to introduce briefly. She's going to come up after I present, and then she'll be followed by Dr. Ferguson, professor as well. Dr. Kravchenko is an assistant professor in the Department of Surgery at Duke University Medical Center. She works extensively in studying the role of multiple factors in disease risk, disease incidence, prevalence, and patient survival. And her focus really is in the role of environmental factors, including air and water quality in disease process. So we're going to hear a lot from her about the public health implications of this. She also is doing Medicare-based and Medicare-linked large health data analysis of cancer and chronic non-cancer diseases, incidence, progression, treatment, effectiveness, and survival among U.S. adults, as well as studies of the role of comorbidities in cancer patients in treatment choice and patient survival. She's also researching the health of residential populations living in close proximity to concentrated animal feeding operations in North Carolina, and the health of people living in close proximity to coal ash pits in North Carolina, two of the areas of flooding concern that we have during hurricane season. She received her MD degree from Minsk State Medical University in Belarus and her PhD at the Belarusian Medical Academy of Postgraduate Education. So she'll be following my presentation. And then we will have Dr. Lee Ferguson, Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Associate Professor of Environmental Sciences and Policy here at Pratt and Nicholas. His research interests include environmental analytical chemistry and applications of high-resolution mass spectrometry to trace organic contaminant analysis. He can tell you what's in the water. A very important thing. He also studies the environmental fate and effects of carbon nanomaterials in the aquatic environment, proteomics in environmental toxicology, and mechanisms of environmental endocrine disruption in aquatic organisms. So he's going to help tell us a lot about the impact of some of these contaminants on the ecology and on the environment in North Carolina as a result of these storms. I'm going to focus a bit on the law, and I'm going to go ahead and start with an apology, which is in my slides. I did not put a slide to talk about the Coastal Zone Management Act and the Coastal Area Management Act. The Coastal Zone Management Act is federal law which sets empowers states along the coastal zone to set their own coastal management policies. North Carolina took advantage of that early through our own Coastal Area Management Act. The excellent presentation that we just heard from Lydia Olander and Carter Smith talking about living shorelines and bulkheads. All of that activity has permitting issues related to it, and nearly all of those revolve around the Coastal Area Management Act. I did have the good fortune during that 14 years of bureaucracy, from which I still haven't quite recovered, of serving as the lead attorney for the North Carolina Coastal Resources Commission. So if you do have questions about those laws, the rules that are implementing those, I'm happy to answer those. Suffice it to say that the laws and the rules governing those types of protection for shoreline change slowly. And so you can get a living shoreline permit, but many contractors are most familiar with just going ahead and building bulkheads, and they're still allowed under North Carolina law in many places. So one thing that's important to know is it's really interesting to me to always point out what is the role that the U.S. government plays in this, and it primarily boils down to the Congress power to regulate commerce among the states, which is an interesting question, and one of the reasons why when we often get into questions about the extent of federal power and most recently, issues related to what is the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, how far does it go? We have to always go to the Supreme Court and talk about the Commerce Clause, and we also have to talk about the intersection of environmental law and constitutional law, and we have that very, very scenario coming up this current term with some petitions for certiorari related to the case coming out of Hawaii on the discharge of pollutants through the groundwater and into the Pacific Ocean. So it's important to know when we talk about all these things about the United States laws, there is always a role for the Supreme Court of the United States to play, and it's a constitutional role as well as a statutory role. So since this is the law segment of the morning, I thought it important to put some law up there for you. You'll get 1 hour's worth of continuing legal education credit for every every acronym that I teach you or every constitutional provision which I cite. So you're now at 1. Next acronym coming up is we lovingly call EPCRA. This is the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. Colloquially, among activists, we think of it as the Bhopal Law. Those of you who may remember the incident in Bhopal, India, where an accidental release of air contaminants poisoned and killed scores, hundreds, thousands of people. And the reaction of the Congress to this incident was to recognize, A, that some of these same chemicals could be found around the United States, and B, they didn't know where they were. And local government responders, local first responders were not aware of the risks in their community posed by these chemicals, and there was not an infrastructure in place federally mandated to make sure consistent across the United States that we had an emergency planning aspect to chemical contaminants in large quantities. So that's what EPCRA really did, was put in place this nice infrastructure across the United States. Wherever you are in an area where EPCRA has had an influence on the structure of state and local government and incident management. So it creates these state emergency response commissions with subsidiary local emergency planning communities and emergency plans for those who have any of the chemical that are listed in the reportable quantity. And it also has an information requirement that they have to inform the public on chemical releases above reportable quantity. This is often referred to as the TRI. Okay, we're at 3 hours now. Toxic release inventory. A big struggle from CAFO advocates. The industry, not the people who are against CAFOs, but the industry itself has been to make exemptions from the toxic release inventory and EPCRA for the CAFOs for animal agriculture, since they tend to release reportable quantities of ammonia on a regular basis, and ammonia is a toxic chemical. Another one was one that I spent a lot of time with when I was at the Attorney General's office. That's the Clean Air Act 112 risk management plans. This was a recognition that in addition to storage of large quantities of chemicals, there were some situations where even a relatively small quantity of chemicals can be in a specific location extremely dangerous. The primary risk that was associated with the study of these is something that all of us bear who live in large municipal areas near a water treatment plant. And here I mean a clean water treatment plant. We tend to disinfect our water with chlorine, which tends to be in large compressed chlorine gas cylinders. And if those were to explode, they would cause a real problem in the immediate vicinity, toxicity, killing people. It's really dangerous. 112 risk management plans now, it's harder to get copies of these after 9/11. During the time that I was working on this, it was pre-9/11, and there was a real thought that these risk management plans would be something that would be widely shared. Unfortunately, they also can be a blueprint for terrorism. That is, if you wanted to sort of tell people, hey, here's where some really bad stuff is, and if you can just get past this fence, here's the kind of havoc you could create. So now there is a lot of Homeland Security regulation that helps keep some of this information available to first responders, but only when they need it on need-to-know basis, and also sort of prevents it generally from being available. 112R still requires the planning and still requires a duty to prevent and mitigate consequences of chemical accidents under the Clean Air Act, which is a very important aspect on these chemical release questions. Then the Clean Water Act itself, which is one that's probably the most common. The first two are the ones we think of as being sort of really dangerous situations. Clean Water Act, though, also is most common in the sense that there are an awful lot of releases and discharges of pollutants which occur on a daily basis, whether or not there is a storm, but certainly in the case of a storm. Clean Water Act creates at the federal level a liability for the discharges of pollutants to waters of the United States. That's where that constitutional limitation comes in. It also provides for civil penalties for certain violations, injunctive relief, and criminal penalties, and it also has provision for citizen suits. The Clean Water Act is probably at the U.S. level one of the most innovative and one of the most important fundamental statutes to help protect us from impacts in floodwaters. It also has planning results as it relates to stormwater infrastructure, since stormwater management is a really key aspect of trying to prevent on a daily basis discharge of common pollutants into our surface waterways. Stormwater management is a really important aspect, and there actually are quite a few toxics which are transmitted by stormwater on a daily basis, whether we know it or not. It can be something as simple as the brake dust off of my car as I parked it this morning, if there's a rainfall and that brake dust hits the pavement, it's going into a stormwater management system, and that brake dust is making its way into the local water body, in my case, an unnamed tributary to Sandy Creek. Get familiar with where the places are that you're discharging pollutants, whether you know them or not. And it really does give us an opportunity then to think about how that stormwater will happen during extreme storm events, because some of these chemical releases we're talking about, there may be chemicals that seem to be high and dry, and then when a storm comes along, all of a sudden they're being transmitted by stormwater to far distant places and impacting far distant people. So there is another set of important laws at the federal level that apply to this. One is CERCLA, liability for hazardous substance discharges, and also under the Superfund law, or the National Priorities List, or NPL. We're at 4 hours now. This stands for the Comprehensive Liability Act. It does require site maintenance for Superfund sites. Many Superfund sites are high and dry during normal conditions, but they can be inundated under floodwaters, and this is a very serious concern as time goes on, as more and more of these sites are put into and monitored natural attenuation. Another, I guess we're at 6 now, acronyms. There's been a real push, instead of cleaning up these sites, because they're very expensive to clean up, to put fences around these sites and then have engineers come and monitor them from time to time to see if they're impacting a community. If you're under monitored natural attenuation, those environmental engineers who go to monitor them can't really stop the floodwater from rushing in and liberating all that contamination and then letting it contaminate the surrounding community. So that's one of the big problems that we're facing now with some of these Superfund sites. We saw this in Texas. I'm going to show you a picture on that in a minute. Then there's the Oil Pollution Act, which is very important, Coast Guard administered. If you see discharges of oil in waters, reporting it to the Coast Guard. The Incident Response Center is often the best first choice. There is a lot of coordination between what the Coast Guard does and what the local DEQ and local emergency first responders do when they're responding to oil spill incidents. And those are some of the most common hazardous chemical environmental contamination that we see, including during storm events. So this is a map of Hurricane Harvey in Houston, and we can see this was from the Washington Post looking at the Superfund site. So each one of these that is a diamond here is a Superfund site. Harvey came and pushed a storm surge up in here and also had locally heavy flooding and rain that flooded this entire area. So we had a situation where Superfund sites that were thought of as being high and dry were completely inundated. And then there's a serious question that's going to have to be resolved by long-term testing as to what was the impact of the flooding releasing all the contaminants. Most of these Superfund sites were associated with petrochemical production and related industries. But this is one of the legacies that we're going to see more and more. And it's a legacy that's not absent in North Carolina. We do have heavy industrial development. We have Superfund sites in our coastal communities. We have Superfund sites specifically near the Port of Wilmington that would be implicated by any of those rising waters. So this is an important question at federal level and as well as state. The North Carolina Constitution sets forth our policy on protection and conservation of natural resources. This is, for North Carolina law, the source of our power as well as the fundamental police power of the state of North Carolina. My first work in real earnest here on the interrelation of hog farms and hurricanes. I'd worked on hog farm issues as early as 1993, but it was when Floyd and Fran came along. Here's a picture of the eye wall of Floyd as it was off the North Carolina coast. After Hurricane Floyd, this is a picture that was taken at aerial photography in the spring, almost 6 months after Hurricane Floyd. This was Browns of Carolina, Swine Farm 5 and 6. You've probably heard of Murphy Brown. This Brown was the second half of that hyphenated name. When the two companies got merged, they got married, they hyphenated their names, and now they're Murphy Browns. This was Brown's Farm 5 and 6. This was 6 months after Floyd. I showed this picture to show you a couple of things, just some general geography of a hog farm. We're going to talk about those later. This is a lagoon. This lagoon was impacted by the hurricane, and it also had been impacted just by force of gravity and erosion over time. The wall here had slumped considerably. These are swine houses. This is the office where the workers would rest during lunch breaks, and this is what's called a spray field, and this is a spray gun. I'm going to show you a picture now of the spray gun in operation, and this is why I got involved, was we had to go in and shut this hog farm down with an injunction because they had created a situation. We talked earlier about wetlands that had been drained for the purpose of agricultural fields. This is a swine farm that was prior converted wetlands. This had been Carolina Bay wetland. Drainage had been put in place to allow this to take place. And even 6 months after Floyd, the water table was so high in these fields that we had active running streams right through the spray field. And so these spray guns, as every time they crossed over, they had actually put in a box culvert of concrete to allow the spray gun to travel over this stream. And then they would sometimes get stuck in some of these ruts here along these other streams. So we had to shut this swine farm down, make them spend a lot of money to get it reopened. It is open to this day. It hasn't fixed the problem with the wetlands, but it does illustrate one of the problems that we have with so many swine farms in eastern North Carolina. They are so close to the water table. So after Floyd, we started implementing state-level swine permits and inspections. And the reason for that was exactly illustrated in that picture that we saw from Browns 5 and 6. The need to have swine farms permitted so that the state regulators knew where they were, and so there'd be minimum criteria or minimum standards applicable to them, and there'd be yearly inspections done on each one of the farms to make sure they were complying with their permits. Unfortunately, there still are, I think it's less than 100 now, swine farms that are located in the 100-year floodplain. And so, but that still is, in my view, anyone that's in the floodplain is one too many. And that we're talking about the 100-year floodplain. We're now experiencing storm events that are more severe than the 100-year flood on a much more frequent basis. This is one from Florence, and this is a lagoon breach. So another thing that can happen is a lot of water will come into one of these lagoons. They're open to the air, and it's coming at the time sort of at the end of the growing season. The lagoons themselves, they use the effluent to spray it on fields during the growing season for crops. The crop they typically use is Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass tends to go dormant around the end of September. So they shouldn't really be applying any waste after September. And here we are in the heart of hurricane season. This is a breach. Nearly the entire contents of this lagoon, except for a sludge layer at the bottom, were emptied into an unnamed tributary. This is an aerial photograph taken in September of last year. Here's a poultry farm. Poultry farms have really a less regulatory status at the moment. They are sort of deemed permitted as long as they do the things they're supposed to do in the regulation. They have a permit, but they don't get annual inspections. They're not required to be taken out of the floodplain. And here's one where even the barns themselves were nearly flooded out, including some of these areas that are areas where they would typically be keeping the poultry litter dry for later application. This is the wastewater treatment plant at Grifton. It's completely surrounded by water. Water treatment plants tend to be located geographically high in any community because they want gravity to do a lot of the work for them. They still need to be near the source water for the community, whereas wastewater treatment plants are often located at a geographic low point in a community because they're trying to take advantage of gravity to allow the sewage to flow to them to then be treated and discharged in the receiving water. What you see here is the result of that, which is the town of Grifton's wastewater treatment plant after Florence is nearly inundated. Now, they do have a berm. You can see a sort of protective berm around here to help keep these treatment works from being inundated. So that was a good proactive measure in advance on their part. Coal ash pit, not so much. Coal ash pits tended to be located near discharge points and intake points for coal-fired power plants. Coal electric generating units use a tremendous amount of water, and so they tend to be located very close to large water bodies that can provide the cooling water that they need to generate the electricity. And the coal ash pits, because it's a very large volume waste, tend to be located right adjacent to those waterways as well. This is from the Sutton Power Station post-Florence, and you had a complete breach of coal ash impoundment there. There's been follow-up study on that has appeared, and we're going to hear some from Dr. Kravchenko about the impact now of both hog farms and I think, I can't remember, talk about coal ash too, but we'll talk about hog farms for sure. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Kravchenko to talk a little bit about those next things.